Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. This is a Currents episode. Currents are shorter and less heavily produced than our full-length episodes and generally focus on a single topic. As always, links to books, articles, and organizations mentioned are available on the episode page at jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Our guest today is Frank Lantz. Frank's a game designer with a focus on exploring emerging technology to create new kinds of gameplay. He's the founding chair of the NYU Game Center and the co-founder of Area Code Games, which was acquired by Zynga in 2011. And he's the co-founder of Everybody House Games and the creator of the game Universal Paperclips. He's working on a book, which will be published by MIT Press in October of 23, called The Beauty of Games. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's really great. It's going to be a lot of fun to talk to you. You know, I get a fair number of over the transom emails for people that want to be on the Jim Rutt Show. And I will confess, you know, a good percentage of them are nuts and what have you. And then another percentage of them are people I'm not all that interested in talking about their topic. But now and then a good one comes through. And when my producer forwarded Frank's inquiry letter along, I said, hell yeah. Turns out Frank is one of the top players of my Network Wars game. And, you know, and then I quickly looked him up, and I also find out he's the dude at the Game Center of NYU. I go, hell yes.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Jim Rutt Show, and that's how I found out about Network Wars. And yeah, I genuinely love it. It's a great game.
Yeah, so we are going to talk mostly about Network Wars today, and we're going to nerd out big time. I know a fair number of our listeners listen to Network Wars, play Network Wars. I'm not listening to it. In fact, everybody turns the sound off pretty quick.
Yeah, so you could listen to podcasts.
Exactly, right? So if anyone wants to play Network Wars, go to networkwars.com or search Network Wars, 2 words, at the Apple App Store on Google Play. It's a mobile game, takes about 30 seconds to learn and at least a few weeks to get pretty good at it. It's a kind of hard game. A typical game only lasts 4 minutes or thereabouts. And it only costs 99 cents with no in-game promotions. It's a nice, clean game. So tell me about your initial reaction. I mean, as a real game pro, I'm really interested to, what did you think when you downloaded it?
Okay, well, I'm going to be honest with you, Jim. When I first booted the game up and took a look at it, it looks too simple to be good. At first you think, you know, wow, this is too simple. Where's the clever hook? It's a very straightforward game. It's a little strategy game. It's played, as people know, but if you haven't played it yet, I'll just quickly describe it. It's a little turn-based strategy game that's played on a procedurally generated network of connected nodes. And you are playing against 4 AI opponents, and you are choosing a node and then attacking a neighboring node. And it's just a simple kind of mathematical operation. Based on what the strength of the node is, you will kind of basically flip a coin for every point of strength. And then if you overpower the neighboring node, then you take it over. And then every turn you're generating more strength based on the size of your largest connected group. And so I looked at it and I played around with it a little bit, and I thought, well, you know, there's really nothing clever or surprising. There's no hook, you know, but it turns out you don't always need a surprising hook or a clever kind of unexpected mechanic. If you take a solid idea and you execute it really cleanly, you can end up with something truly great. And I think that's what you've got with Network Wars. It turns out to be a really fun game. It's really interesting. It's really enjoyable to kind of go deep with it. I've been playing it a lot. And yeah, it's what I would call a kind of minimalist game. And I think that it's kind of surprising these days to come across something like this that really embraces the minimalism and goes deep with it and produces something great that way.
Well, you caught it exactly because, I've been, as I was mentioning in the pregame discussion, I've been a gamer since I was 10 years old when I started playing Avalon Hill tabletop games. And, I went through the Atari phase and the Apple phase and the Commodore phase and the PC phase and some of the console phases. So I've always been into games. But I have found many games they're too complicated. They're no longer elegant. There's no elegance. Like checkers and chess are kind of elegant games. Go is a super elegant game. And so when I decided I don't even quite why I decided, but I decided I was going to try my hand at creating an elegant game. And I sort of thought about the genres of games. And I said, I'm going to take the game of Risk and that family of Risk type games and see if I can eliminate absolutely everything that's not necessary. And, I went through 5 or 6 design iterations, and each one had less complexity, complicatedness, I should say, not the complexity. As a Santa Fe Institute complexitorian, right. I don't want to use complexity wrong, but a complicatedness until after a couple of weeks, I got down to a Windows prototype of what's basically the current game. And I said, I don't think I can make it any simpler. I did eliminate one last thing, which was an option on how the reinforcements came in. There's, logically a couple of different ways you could have automated reinforcements. And I had 2 in the original prototype. And then I said, nope, I'm just going to go with 1. And
what was the, just out of curiosity, what was the other one? Because currently you just get reinforcements along your border. And they're kind of randomly distributed evenly. But so what was the other alternative?
Well, it's quite obvious if you're looking for minimalism. The other minimalist one is randomly across all the armies in the largest connected network.
Got it. So it would have been along all this stuff. Yeah. So again, this is an example of something that I think is one of the strengths of the game. I love the reinforcement rule. And I think it's a great example of your design process. This idea of just getting rid of everything you can and kind of boiling it down to its essence. And it really worked. And again, it's just unusual. It's an unusual approach. I would say that we live in an era where the dominant game design aesthetic is almost the opposite of that, right? It's a kind of, I think of it as Pokemon is a good touchstone for this, because a lot of the beauty of Pokemon is in the intentionally complicated nature of the materials. Like all these different Pokemon, each one has its own set of stats and affinities and strengths and weaknesses. And a lot of the pleasure of Pokemon is kind of memorizing this vast quantity of data. League of Legends is an extremely good game, extremely popular contemporary game, very similar in its aesthetic approach. If you sat down to try to learn League of Legends, you almost can't. It's not the kind of game you can sit down and learn. It's the kind of game you have to kind of just imbibe as part of your generational experience. You just got to grow up, and so, but there is this other approach of thinking, what is the simplest possible expression of an idea or a mechanic, and in some ways, that it really is, it goes to the heart of what games are about, because this idea that you can find a surprising amount of complex and interesting behavior in a very simple set of rules and materials, that's really the magic of games.
Yep, that was indeed my intent. It quite literally was my intent. And then from that point, I had to then tune the game, because as a gamer yourself, it's an iterative process to get a good game. Yeah. And so the 2 other things I played with first one was play balance, basically. And one of the other things that annoyed me in kind of the mobile game world is most of them were way too easy. The quick play, easy play phone games 5 years ago, you could generally play them 20 times and master them more or less, or figure out that they were too ridiculous to ever master. Yeah. And so I chose to tune Network Wars to be pretty hard, but you could see yourself growing in knowledge. Yeah. And you'll never be able to, win 100% of the time. At least nobody ever has. And I would predict that nobody ever will win every game in 1,000 plays.
Oh yeah, I mean we can talk about that, but I'm pretty sure that the maximum win rate is close to 76, maybe 77 or 78, possibly. I don't think it's anywhere near 100.
Yeah, we'll talk about the stats
Yeah,
a little
yeah.
bit. But you're pretty close. And so, they're interesting. The things that I tuned, the size and aspect ratio of the network turns out to make a significant difference with this particular set of gameplay. And I came up with 6x7. And then the other one is the ratio of nodes to links. Turns out, or put it this way, the algorithm that generates the links and the nodes with essentially an affinity and probability of establishing a link on a node, et cetera. So call it the density of the network, approximately. And you tune both of those things, and they change actually the win-loss rate. Because I wrote some AIs that could play in simulation, so I'd run 10,000 games and see what the average win rate of an AI playing the human was. Then I'd tweak things and run another batch job until I targeted 80%, as I said, that a genius player should be able to win 80%. But it turns out you're approximately right in the data that such a paragon has not yet appeared, though one guy did for a short period of time. Let me see if I can find my data here. No, actually, I don't have that handy. But there are people who have won over 80% for their whole career, but their careers have been short, like 130 games.
Yeah, I
Like
mean, look, I can win 80% over any arbitrarily long run of games. But when you're talking about the true long run,
yeah,
I think we're getting close. We're asymptotically approaching the maximum possible.
Yeah, so I'll give you
Rate.
your score here, right?
Yeah, okay.
74.9% win-loss average over 7,948 games. And that makes you 14th on the all-time hit parade of all players. But most of those are people who've played a few hundred times. In the category of 1,000 plays or more, you're up near the top. There's two other people that are above both you and I who have played more than 5,000 times. And one of them, mysterious, I just have a user number for him, Mr. X. He's played 11,864 times. It's a lot. He has a win-loss record of 75.6. He's actually, I would say he's the best of the many plays. And here's the other two things that are quite impressive about him, beats both you and I. One of the statistics that I just actually ran for the first time yesterday, I've been saying I'm going to do this forever, but I finally got around to doing it yesterday, is the longest maximum win run. Because, again, this is a short game, takes 4 to 5 minutes to play, and you get in a groove and you win 20 in a row, right?
Yeah.
It feels great. And, truthfully, I was never quite sure what my maximum win run rate was, but I now know. But anyway, Mr. X, his maximum win run is 35, which is really amazing.
Wow, that's pretty good.
And also the best he ever did in 100 rolling game, 100. One of the figures of merit that I use when I play, I don't know about you, but I'm always looking at how I'm doing in the last 100 games, because that seems to be a statistic that's stable enough to tell me where I'm at. And also when my focus starts to degrade, you can see it starting to go down. And his best 100 might be the highest anybody ever did, is 92.
Wow, that's pretty good.
That's 92.
Yeah,
Now,
Frank, that is impressive.
Yeah, so Mr. X is probably a bit better than you, and you're a bit better than I am. Your longest win run is 33, which is pretty damn impressive.
That's not bad. Yeah.
So you've won 33 games in a row at least once.
Yeah.
And your max 100 was 91, so only one less than Mr. X.
Okay, all right.
That's pretty good. And that ranks you 14th, the win-loss rate, 14th of all players, but that includes a bunch with relatively small players.
Again, we all agree we're going to to those out.
Yeah. So of the big play of the Mr. Bigs, you're number 2 or number 3. There's another guy who the statistics aren't quite canonical. But anyway, you're number 2 or number 3.
So 75.6. Okay, that's what I've got to beat if I want to get to the number one spot.
You want to be Mr. X. And then myself, as the inventor who knows how it works, just slightly worse than Frank, which that's interesting. And I've played 9,021 times versus Frank's 7,948 times. So that's fairly similar. I ranked 18th on the total depth chart. My win rate is 74.1 versus Frank's 74.9. However, my max win run is only 25. I was kind of surprised and somewhat disappointed, while Frank's was 33. and my max 100 was 85, exactly where I predicted it would be, because I had a sense that I get to 74, 84, and I try to get it up, and it usually doesn't go. And I never remembered ever being higher than 84, but I said, I'll bet there was a time I wasn't paying attention when I made 85. And
Yeah.
it turns out I did. But yours at 91 is quite a bit more impressive. So, your claim to be the top network worst player in the world is damn close. You're in the top 3 for sure, and a bit better than me.
Well, this is scary. I mean, being number 2 is worse because now I have a reason to keep going until I beat Mr. X. But I mean, it's really interesting to look at these stats and try to figure out which of them are meaningful. I think most games of Network Wars are kind of decided in the first setup. You look at a board, and in many cases, there is no path to victory. You just there's certain starting conditions where there's no amount, no expert play is going to get you to win those games. Those are just losses, and
it's not quite true. Not quite true.
Is that not true? Come on, that's got to be true.
Well, I have yet to find a game that if I play it 20 times, I can't beat it. Because now one of the things that annoys all my players is I don't allow replays of games, right?
Right.
And I have a theory on why I do that. Also, something else, which not too many people know, a few people do, is every player plays the same sequence of games.
Ah.
Because I originally did this as a cognitive science experiment to see how humans learn. And so everybody plays the same sequence. So when someone gets to 7,948, they'll have played the exact same games you had.
That's so good. That is so good. I'm really glad you did it that way.
Well, here's something that's even scarier in terms of make it comparable. The dice rolls that happen under the skin always use the same random number generator for each game. So if there is a bias in the dice rolls, a short run bias in the dice rolls at the game level, every player gets the same rolls of the dice. But because they play the game differently, the impact of those same dice rolls are different. It's the order of the dice rolls are the same. So again, it increases the comparability across players. So we can actually look at a given game and see how good you are in a given game and know that everything else was equal.
Sure, like they do in bridge, like duplicate.
Exactly, duplicate, very similar to duplicate bridge. So let me then go on to another design decision. I'd love to give your feedback as Mr. Game. The combat results are kind of like Risk, but they're not the same as Risk. In large N, lots of trials, a bigger stack will beat a smaller stack on average over, 1,000 tries or 100 tries. But unlike Risk, there's a lot more variance in the outcome. And this drives people crazy, including myself. I mean, I've seen an 11 lose to a 2, which would never happen in Risk. But in my game, an 11 happened to 2 is unusual, but not out of the ordinary. So think about the statistical distribution I used as being more fat-tailed than your typical dice roll type outcome. And some people think that's a great feature, and some people it drives nuts, the very high stochasticity in the combat results.
It works for me, because that is a combination that I like a lot. I'm a poker player, Jim. I don't know if you play a lot of poker, but
I used to.
Okay, so that combination of high skill and high variance is like catnip for me. I just love it. There's something that just tickles my fancy about something where you can do, where you're rewarded for doing a very deep model and for doing a very deep analysis and for calculating, and yet at the same time you're in the wildness of super high variance, and you just have to embrace it, and you have to, in all of your models and all of your calculations have to include it and account for it. To me, that is a great place to be. My brain just loves being in that space. So I'm a big fan. Now, is it accurate the way I model it in my head is that I see the two nodes, so the node that's attacking and the node that is defending, I see them as almost like a stack of units where each unit, they flip a coin against each other. And as soon as one wins, the other unit is eliminated. And then you just keep doing that down the whole stack until there's zero left in one of the stacks. or zero left in the defender stack, and then you move the last unit, or you move one, you move all of the units, leaving one behind. Is that accurate? Is that the right way to model
Very
it?
close. It's not quite a fair coin flip, but it's very, very, very close, because that was another little twisty parameter.
Ooh, what type of coin flip is it?
Slightly weighted. It's very
Towards the
slightly
towards the attacker.
towards the attacker by a tiny bit. It's
And is there any difference in the roles between the human and the
no, no,
bots?
no, no. The one
Okay.
thing that
'Cause
I
it
will
seems
say,
like there are, but I knew there probably wasn't,
yeah,
because
yeah,
I know how my brain works. But I'm like, because you notice the ones that are super unfair against you. You don't notice the ones that are super unfair in your favor.
I'll confess, I actually went back and looked at the code, because I was convinced that I must have implemented it to be more stochastic for the human than for the AIs. And nope, it uses the exact same function call.
Good.
There's
I'm happy. I'm happy that you did that. And I think that was the right decision. It's funny, in game design, there is a tendency to bend randomness in favor of the player and in favor of the player's instincts. Even someone like Sid Meier, who is obviously a genius game designer, the creator of the Civilization series,
and the really cool Gettysburg game, which is also really good.
Brilliant designer, and someone who, very influential. He's the person who said a game is a series of interesting choices, right? So he's very famous and influential. But when he talks about randomness, he often, he says, look, I mean, you want to make it feel right to the player. True randomness doesn't feel right, because what the player has in their mental model is a kind of randomness that's more smooth, it's more evenly distributed, it's not as spiky as real randomness. And so we make it so that after you've had a couple of, inconvenient rolls, we just make sure that you get the roll that you're looking for. And it drives me crazy, because I think the part of the beauty of games is that they force you to wrap your head around the reality of a surprising truth. That's something that the world doesn't work the way you think it does, and so having to kind of update your models and realize that randomness is spiky and has these character, like that's what happens in poker. Like, poker doesn't accommodate for you and your preconceptions and your biases. It just is what it is, and that is part of its spiky beauty.
Now, it's interesting. Now let's tie it back to your comment about unwinnable scenarios, and my assertion that, as far as I will say, I haven't tried every scenario. There might be one that are just totally unbeatable, but I do have a backdoor for myself that allows me to replay scenarios.
Yeah.
And I've sometimes had to play 20, 25 times, but the way you win is not by having a better strategy. The way you win is by being lucky. Right. And so from my poker days, and this is actually quoted in a book by Michael Mauboussin, who's a fairly famous Wall Street guy. He happened to hear me give a talk once on it, which is, as a systematic strategy for life, learn from poker is, when you're behind, raise the variance. Right.
Yes.
Because if you get one of those scenarios that suck, if you play straightforward, the equivalent of being a rock in Texas Hold'em, you will lose. Right. The only way you're going to win is get wild. And wild plus lucky. But if you're not wild, if you play conservatively or straight, exactly balanced, the amount of luck that you will need is so much that you're not likely to get it. But if you do crazy shit and you get lucky 2 or 3 times, then you change the situation and change the whole scenario. And so, even the one in particular, which is one of the early scenarios that everybody complains about and says is unwinnable, I actually have beaten it by that approach, by taking a really radical, a strategic approach and getting lucky.
Okay, so you're saying that theoretically it's possible to win any starting setup because of this wide variance. So because of this wide variance, when you're in a setup that looks unwinnable, you can just take some crazy swings, and then since you can restart it over and over again, eventually you'll flip 10 heads in a row, and you'll beat it that way.
Yep.
But that's different. That's different from saying each of these. Okay, I see what you're saying. So technically, in that sense, they're winnable, and in some universe, some lucky person might end up, at the far end of that distribution and end up winning a bunch like that. But in the universe that we live in, that's not going to happen. And
well, interestingly, this famously difficult early scenario, a couple of people have won it. Just noobs who were just playing for the first time, and they just have, out of 25,000, two or three have beaten it. And when I play with one of my low rent AIs that plays the human, it's not very smart. If I play, I think it's 100,000 times, it'll beat it once or twice.
Yeah.
So again, it's winnable, but it's just very, 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 very difficult.
There's another way you could think about this, which is because you are using the same seed to generate all of the actions in the game, right? If you knew that, you would have a complete picture of exactly what's going to happen as the result of every encounter. And in that scenario, you would be back in a universe where there are some setups that you can't win.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
you can win them if you're allowed to skip ahead until you get that extremely lucky stretch of outcomes, and then use that in the right way to win the scenario. But given the fact that we all have to work our way through that same kind of predetermined set of dice rolls, you're going to go through stretches where you can't win.
Not quite true. Actually, think about it hard, because it just makes it more difficult, right? Because you're playing blindsman's bluff or find the needle in the haystack, but the needle is still there. It's just you have no principled way to find the needle, but it's still there. So it's just
so even if you exposed that, you say, look, I'm going to show you the next. I'm going to show you all of the roles in the order that you're going to get them.
It'd be a lot easier. It'd be a hell of a lot easier if you could see that. But I do not let the AI see that, and I don't let the humans see that.
Right. But in that scenario, you think that I could use that information to sort of find a winning path from every...
Oh, it'd make it a lot easier. Yeah, think about it from a calculation complexity.
Yeah, it's certainly advantageous. Clearly good for you to have that. I just think in some cases, you're still going to look and say, okay, there is no correct path to winning from this startup.
And I would say that is possible. I like that idea. And I think I may just get psyched to try that and see if I can write an agent that does use that information and see if it can boost its win rate to a ridiculous degree, even on the worst scenarios.
I will pre-register my prediction, which is that there won't be such an agent. So, and we can have a little friendly bet on it. But I think that's a great question.
Okay, all right. Let's bet a bottle of whiskey on.
Perfect.
In the first 100,000 games in the sequence. Your proposition is there's at least one that can't be beat by an automaton that has look ahead on all the dice rolls.
Perfect. I love that. Yeah, I love my side of this bet, and I can't wait to see what whiskey you're going to get for me.
Yeah, this is one. I'll get you something good. I hope you're a single malt man. A single malt or bourbon, your choice, right?
Oh, either one is fine. I trust you.
Okay. All right. Well, now we've talked a fair bit about some of the design decisions that went into it, and you actually have sniffed them out. The fact that it's a coin flip rather than a dice roll, very few people have figured that out. But if you play it enough, and if you have the right kind of mind, it does sort of become obvious after a while.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's just if you want to get good at a game, it just you end up sort of discovering what is happening under the hood, and that's part of the pleasure, I think, of trying to get good at a game, is that it just rewards you for thinking and having a kind of accurate vision for what you're interacting with.
Yeah, but you were correct, actually. It's an almost perfectly fair coin, but not quite, just tiny. Just because I wanted to tune my guesstimate of where the maximum win-loss of 80%.
Yeah.
Now, next thing, after I wrote this, and I think maybe it was just after I had it out on test flight with a few users of the mobile version. I think I had 50 users of the mobile version after I had 13 users of the Windows version when I was just prototyping it. I played it a bunch, an embarrassingly large amount, and fortunately, it does not show up in my current number of 9,021. It was probably another 3,000 or 4,000. And one of the things I did during that process is I wrote down 50 heuristics that I discovered. And in fact, part of the reason I did this originally was to start to understand the idea of heuristic induction from a cognitive science perspective. Something I've been saying for a long time in the other work I do in the artificial general intelligence area, that I believe we will find that at least the low ends of artificial general intelligence are going to be in part driven by the ability to induce heuristics, rules of thumb. The world is very, very complicated. It's actually complex, right? And in the land of complexity, it turns out you can't solve very much in closed mathematical form, and you even can't get reliable and stable results from quantitative modeling or even agent-based simulations in high complexity. But rules of thumb is how we get through life. See a lion, run, right? Things of that sort. And so as I played the game, I wrote down, I still have the paper someplace. I couldn't find it, unfortunately. I think it's at my other office. Wanted to review it today, but it was really fun to record these heuristics. And they were written down in a way that if I had everybody's complete gameplay, I could actually see what heuristics they're using, or at least on a probabilistic basis. Did you have the sense as you were learning the game that you were gradually uncovering a stack of heuristics?
Yeah, I totally did. And I think that one of the marks of a great strategy game is exactly this feeling of climbing the ladder of heuristics. There's a great book about games by Richard Garfield and Scaphalias. Richard Garfield, the creator of Magic the Gathering, wrote a book called Characteristics of Games. And he uses this phrase, the ladder of heuristics. And I think there's one of the deep pleasures of trying to get good at a game is this feeling of incorporating these rules of thumb into your thinking, almost like cognitive tools. At first, you encounter them, they're explicit. At first, you think of them as like, okay, this is a little rule I need to follow and it's going to help me win. And then eventually it almost becomes second nature. You don't even think about that because now you're at a higher level and you're encountering a new rule of thumb, which again, at first you make explicit. You're thinking, okay, I should always do this in this situation. Oh, here's one of the situations. I recognize it. Now let me apply this little rule. And you're doing it very consciously and explicitly. But then eventually, again, it kind of gets incorporated into your thinking and it becomes second nature. And now you're at an even higher level and you're developing a new heuristic at a more strategic, kind of more abstract layer. And you just keep doing this, right? And you keep building this kind of deeper and deeper understanding into your model of the game. And I think that it is, yeah, I think it's part of what I love so much about games, because it's a way of kind of seeing your brain operate. Like you normally, like you live inside your brain and it's not, you can't see it. It's like the fish for whom water is invisible. What's water? It's like, well, what's a brain? What's a mind? What is problem solving? Because we exist inside of problem solving, right? And it's invisible to us because we, in a sense, we are comprised, we were comprised by problem solving. And yet when you play a game, it's like you're able to see your own mind at work and see how it encounters the world, see how it bumps up against a problem and starts to analyze it and then develops a rule of thumb to deal with it, and then incorporates that into its kind of natural, organic kind of like low level processing, and then kind of like reframes the problem at a higher level and keeps going. And games are great at that. They're like little laboratories where we get to kind of take our brains out and examine them and see them operate. And I think a truly good game really has a rich ladder of these things. Whereas like if you think about any problem you encounter, it can fail to be a good game by either being trivial and right away you see an optimal solution and then that solution just works all the time. Or it can be intractable in the sense that there is no good rule of thumb for improving your results except to solve the whole thing, right? And so those are the two ways that problems can fail to be interesting. But a really interesting problem is one that is kind of semi-tractable in the sense that you can get better results by applying these rules of thumb, and you can do that in a continuous manner. So you're not just encountering this cliff where you have to solve the whole thing. you're actually able to kind of get better and better by taking these. What I think of a heuristic as almost like a shortcut through search space. Like my basic meta rule of thumb is, if you can search, you should. So like if you're in the end game of chess, right? There's no point in applying a heuristic. Like if you know there's a mate somewhere on the board, just search until you see the mate. Right? Don't like, you should not be doing a thing where it's like, oh, I'm going to control the
Yeah,
center,
yeah,
or
yeah,
I'm going to
exactly.
develop my pieces, or I'm going to, I'm going to have a good exchange. No, just find the mate. If there's a mate, just find it. Right? So if you can search, you should search. But most of the time you can't search because you don't have an infinite amount of computational resources to throw at a problem. So when you can't search, that's when you are applying heuristics. And what heuristics are doing is they're really showing you these paths that are almost like shortcuts through search space. They're ways of I don't know, they're like tunnels. They're like, like tunneling, like hyperdimensional tunnels through search space.
Yeah, if we were to talk about it in complexity science terms, I like to think of them as dimensional reductions, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
If the real space is like really high dimensional, we can't actually process formally, a 20,000 dimensional space, but we can kind of do some thinking in a 4-dimensional space. And so
Yeah.
Heuristics, is one way of thinking about heuristics at least, are a set of settings in a low dimensional space which are tractable to human reason. And humans aren't that smart, right? There you go. We can be beat by a $1.95 calculator, right? When it comes to adding numbers up. And as it turns out, our phone can beat us at chess, and large language models will soon be able to write better than anybody less than the very, very best of us.
Yeah.
And so we have to have these heuristics because we're not that smart. We can only operate in a certain level of complicatedness, and inducing those. But that's also going to be true of computers because the world is just amazingly complicated and complex.
Yeah.
The ability to somehow find these heuristics is still a human superpower.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like even in a domain where it is completely deterministic, and the problem is, in a sense, games exist to create problems that are the opposite of wicked problems, right? Because in a game, the problem is well defined, it's incredibly simple, it's clearly stated, and we're going to reduce as much of the kind of fuzzy, complicated noisiness of the world. We're going to isolate a very simple problem and create a toy universe in which this problem is clearly stated and the outcome of success is clearly defined. The criteria is right in front of you. And even then, you find yourself in a thing that is almost infinitely rich and complex and surprising, where we still have to use all of our creativity, right? We still have to improvise and be creative and come up with ideas. And that's one of the wonderful things about games, is they show how deeply rich and complex the world is, even when you isolate a single corner of it.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, your initial reaction to Network Wars is, damn, this is like really, really simple. Were you surprised at how much emergent complexity there turned out to be?
I mean, I kind of expected there to be more there than it looked like because I knew you and I knew the kinds of topics you're interested in. I knew your background, and I just kind of trusted that there was going to be some meat on the bone. You know what I mean? But I will also say that, like, even I, who have a taste for this kind of stuff, I have a taste for simple games, minimalist games. Even I was a little bit surprised, and I think it's partly because, I don't know, in game design, we tend to have a reliance on cleverness. That part of when you encounter a new game, even if you're a kind of a game design snob that has a very developed kind of literacy about games and genres and stuff like that, you're often looking for the novelty in the mechanics. Do you know Rainer Knizia, the board
No,
game designer?
no.
Yes, he's a famous board game designer. He's one of the people who ushered in this new era of Euro-style board games that,
Like Settlers of Catalan or
yeah,
something like
exactly. And Euro games can be very simple, but they often have this kind of interesting twist where a mechanic is unusual. Rainer Knizia is especially good at this kind of thing, where you'll say, oh, okay, well, your score is the result of the difference between your two closest neighbors or something like that. Some little strange, surprising hook. And so, I'm often kind of looking for that. Okay, what's going on here that is going to, introduce this kind of novel, surprising thing? But instead, I think in your case, I think in the case of Network Wars, it really is it's the graph itself. It's the play field itself. Like what you have done, you took this tradition of connection games, right? There's this existing tradition. Go is in this tradition. There are also, games like Nash or Hex, Y, Mudcrack Y. All of these games, Twixt is an example of, games that involve understanding the kind of network topology of a graph and like building a game out of that. And I would say, yeah, Network Wars is definitely in this tradition. There are computer versions of this. Slay is an old PC game that is, I think there are mobile versions of that too, where again, it's kind of a minimalist version of a traditional strategy game on a map with interesting connections, like a Risk-like map. But I think what you did by really going deep on the graph itself, on the play field being procedurally generated, and so the connections are always different, the topology is always different. I think that is really the heart of the game. But I will say that for me, there's one thing in particular that makes Network Wars was kind of the biggest and most surprising insight that I got out of this game. And it has to do with the AI. So the fact that you had this minimalist approach and you reduced everything means that the opponents in the game are also incredibly simple. Right? You made these very simple models. They don't really take a strategic approach. Instead, they have very simple deterministic behavior. And because you did it that way, you as the human player, that ends up being in some ways the heart of the game. Right? The heart of the game is this kind of bot diplomacy where you are manipulating the opponents against each other in order to your own advantage, right? Because you are able to model them very accurately because you know exactly basically the algorithm that determines their behavior. And as a result, you can often be vastly outnumbered. But because you can model them and they can't model you, you're able to direct their behavior. And so it's like you're this tiny. I've had games where I'm on a single node, and there are these two vast armies surrounding me. But because I can, I know that they're going to fight each other. I'm able to like sneak in, and then eventually at the right moment to take over the entire map. There's nothing more fun. It's the peak fun of Network Wars is to do this.
Yeah, I had one of those about a month ago, and I sent it to some of my Network War friends. I had one node. I will say the node had 11 strength points on it, and I had an intuition that this was winnable. And so I started taking screenshots. I had a series of 5 screenshots and sent them to my Network Wars buddies. Yeah. And indeed, I did win exactly the way you did. I saw that there was probably going to evolve a situation where I could break out, make the guys fight each other, and then isolate one of them, kill him, and then come back and kill the other guy. And indeed, it worked out.
So realizing this really led me to an epiphany. The epiphany that I had was that the bots in Network Wars aren't opponents at all. They're really just rules. They are in the game the same way that gravity is in Tetris, right? You don't think of gravity as an opponent. You don't think of gravity as a player that you're playing against in Tetris. It's just a rule of the game. It's just one of the material facts about the game is that pieces behave in this way because gravity causes them to go down. Well, the opponents in Network Wars are just like that, right? They are part of the game. And this was like, wow, this is a new way for me. Like, I guess in some ways, this is true of all games that have deterministic AIs in them. But because of the way that you implemented these AIs so simply in a way that made them kind of transparent to the player, this was the first time I'd really thought of this fact, right? That in a sense, any deterministic AI can be thought of not as an opponent. it's not that you and the AIs are both playing this game. It's that really you're playing the game and the AIs are inside the game. They're just pieces in the game, right? They're just rules of the game. And then it led me to like another thought, which was, well, this is kind of true of any AI, right? Any AI is like this, right? In a sense. And then ultimately it led me to realize, well, in a way, I'm like this. Do you know what I mean? My behavior in the game is produced by something, right? It is the result of something. You have a strategy that determines your moves. Now you can't see that strategy clearly, but in a sense, someone could, right? Someone could look at you and see that you yourself are also like this. Like in a sense, there is, at first, once you realize this about the AIs in network wars, it feels great because it feels like it's like you're a sphere visiting flatland, right? You can see a dimension along a dimension that they can't see because they're embedded inside of it. Like you can see them from above and they can't see you. And it's just this amazing feeling. But then you kind of realize, well, I'm like that myself, right? Like I have this advantage over the AIs in network wars, but in a sense, I'm also embedded in whatever, deterministic space that I'm in that is causing me, whatever strategy I'm applying to determine my actions within the game. And in a sense, all there is really is the game. there are neither opponents nor players. There is just the game.
I like that. That's an interesting.
Yeah, it was a lovely epiphany. It really changed my perspective, not just on your game, but on games in general. And it kind of blew my mind a little bit.
Interesting. Now, I made that decision because I actually have 4 or 5 other AIs that I tested, and this one is definitely the stupidest, right, of the ones I've used. But I had the epiphany of what I was trying to accomplish, of course, after the fact, right? As often some of our best insights are after the fact.
Yeah.
We just stumble into, and I realized what I'd created. I'd created the equivalent of swarming behavior in complexity science, where it turns out you can model fish schools and bird swarms with remarkably simple algorithms. I mean, ridiculously simple, where all the elements are running the same algorithm and they produce what looks like highly intelligent coordinated behavior, but they're running equivalent of 10 lines of code, right? And one of the things people are always they're often surprised. It often takes people a long time to realize how dumb the agents are because they do things that seem smart, like they fill up their end of the space and then they build a wall and then they build up and then they break through, kind of the same things that humans do, but they do it through a swarm-like behavior rather than there's no analysis at all. They're just amazingly shallow, but nonetheless, the behavior looks smarter than it actually is, in the same way that bird flocks and schools of fish are smarter than they are. And the wars between the bots also just seem a little smarter than you'd think once you realize what the agents are actually like.
Yeah. One of the things that happens often is that you'll look at a board and you'll be like, okay, well, I can tell what's going to happen next turn because this guy's going to go here and this guy's going to go there, and I'm safe because he'll go over here. And then the bots manage to like do a thing where they get in their own way. You know what I mean? Where they kind of like cut themselves off. And as a result, they end up attacking you in a way you didn't expect because they cut off their own best move. And it's just so aggravating.
Yeah, the famous one that happens to me. So, the most likely thing they're going to do this, they'll leave me safe because there's 2s next to my 2s. Therefore, they can attack me. But one of them ends up attacking the 2 and turning it into a 0. And then somebody else attacks as the 0 and then attacks me. And I go, God damn it. Or occasionally a bot will just get this incredible run. I call it the Prussian style, where they're just unstoppable. They just plow through far more intermediate little ones than you would ever think that was possible. And then they'd hammer my critical but weak position, and then I'm screwed, right?
Yeah, I hate when that happens. It's
funny.
Happens.
It does.
When you talk about heuristics, I think one of the first heuristics that someone develops in network wars is the idea that you sometimes want to skip your first turn. Like knowing whether to skip your first turn, I would say, is almost like the first like the first step of getting good at network wars.
And actually, it's the reversal of the anti-pattern that most people start with, which they start with trying to expand as fast as they can on the first turn, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, there are times that is correct, but
Oh,
not
absolutely.
very often.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the next, if I put out next version, one of the things I'm going to capture statistically is how often do people not move at all on the first turn? And my guess, the good players, it's 40 or 50% of the time.
Yeah, I'd say that's about right.
Yeah. On the other hand, every once in a while, you see a first move which is just devastating, and you take it and you do all kinds of crazy shit. But
Yeah,
and sometimes you just move one piece out of the way to let two guys get into. I'll hold your coat. Let these two guys fight, right?
exactly.
And those
Exactly.
things. But probably 40, 50% of the time, the best play is to do nothing. But knowing when to do nothing and when to do something is what moves you from being kind of a low 60% player up to a high 60%
Yeah.
player, I suspect.
Yeah. Another thing that happens as you get better at the game is starting to think about it almost in thermodynamic terms. Like you're looking at pressure building up and you're like, ooh, I really need to puncture this to like let this fluid out of here so it can flow over here. And you're really looking at these things in terms of flows. It's all like, this chunky mathematical stuff, but it really does feel like, ooh, I need to kind of like, yeah, I need to deflate this thing over here so that this thing can expand into it. And thinking holistically like that.
Yeah, let me think of another kind of chemistry analogy that I sometimes use, which is fluid dynamics and viscosity. Sometimes the opponents have lots of big chunky pieces behind the
Yeah.
lines, right? You go, that's going to be hard to break through. Shit. But other times, even though they have lots of nodes, they're really kind of thin on the ground, so their viscosity is low, and you can puncture through. And other times you can't. And then kind of the meta game, this is kind of up in the 40th or the 50th heuristics, is say, how is it likely the situation will change over the next 2 or 3 turns with respect to this viscosity? Will the density go down because the guys are fighting each other, or will it go up because these guys have kind of reinforced positions where the reinforcements will make them stronger and stronger? And
Yeah.
that's one, to my mind, almost like the Zen. You're now getting really high up near the top of the stack. Some of us talk about the need to be both mentally tight and loose at the same time, very much like in poker, right?
Yeah.
You have to know when to wait and you have to know when to go.
Yeah.
And early on, there are people who are biased towards going too often, but then they're often in their intermediate trajectory of learning seem to wait too long. And so having the ability to analyze the situation, know when to wait and when to go.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you in your
Yeah,
gameplay?
it totally does. It's every turn of network wars involves like modeling what you think is going to happen on the next turn and looking ahead, a few turns to kind of predict what the likely outcomes are, and then thinking, okay, what can I do to improve my position given this prediction of what's going to happen, and then knowing how much risk I need to take. So going back to this idea, that you had of knowing where you are, how safe you are, right? So if things look bad,
Yeah. When you're don't lose a winning position, but if you have a
right?
losing position, raise the variance, right?
Exactly. So if you think, oh, things are not looking great, then that's when you need to start taking some risks. I need to get lucky. I need to give myself an opportunity to get lucky, right? So then you're like finding situations where you're maximizing your chances of getting lucky in both directions, both getting lucky as an aggressor and then maybe getting lucky on the following turn when the bots are moving, getting lucky by having them be unlucky. And knowing when to put yourself in those situations, I think is the real edge that you get as a long-term player.
Yeah, now you're getting up into probably, the upper 40s of the heuristics.
Yeah.
That, once you start to see those things, then your gameplay moves up another couple of points.
Yeah, I think the earliest heuristics are understanding this idea of when you want to skip a turn, also understanding the strength of position versus raw power, right? Like you want to be in a corner, you want to be on an edge, you don't want to be in between two opponents, and being in a corner. And there's also this idea of surface area, right? How much of your territory is bordering other people's territory? Because the smaller that ratio, the more kind of power you're going to have in the nodes that you're building up reinforcements in. And so like understanding the strength of that and knowing when to trade off size of territory for position, I think is one of the earlier heuristics that's really important.
Yep, absolutely. And some of that, as I was learning the game, I kind of adapted from Risk. When I play Risk, I tend to be a grab Australia or South America early kind of guy, right?
Yeah.
Because they have the least surface area, and
Yeah.
then you can build up your power at the borders more rapidly than your opponents who have what's the worst one I think is Europe maybe or Asia has just too many entry points, even
Yep.
though they're
Yep.
bigger and stronger. The ratio of area inside to area outside turns out to be important. And it's often, I find it's an interesting play on seemingly difficult scenarios when you fight your way through, get some luck on your side, and grab a peninsula that you had no business grabbing, for
Yeah.
instance, right?
It's so satisfying. Um, one of the things I think about sometimes is how the game would change if it were played between 5 human opponents. Um, and
Yep.
I think what you would find is that in some ways, I think it would be interesting to do. I think it would be a totally different game. I think ultimately the game would become much more a game about king making. It would be a game with lots of politics. It would be a game in which you're always incentivized to not attack, right? Because when you attack, you're going to make yourself weaker and the person you attack weaker, and so you're really making 3 of your opponents stronger. So everyone's kind of disincentivized to attack, and you're going to have these strange kind of political and psychological and social norms that emerge over the course of many games, right? There's a wonderful game, another mobile game called Galcon, which I played, which is
How do you spell that?
Galcon. And Galcon is similar in some ways. It also comes from this heritage of connection games. It is real time instead of turn based, and you have these planets and you're sending ships back and forth. But it's the same kind of like minimalist abstract strategy game with reinforcements. But in Galcon, it's human opponents, and again, it kind of like it quickly becomes this very elaborate game of diplomatic negotiations. It is really a king-making game. And the only reason it works is because it has short game sessions. I'm a huge fan of short sessions. I think that's one of the reasons poker works. Like poker would not work if every hand took half an hour. Poker works because despite the fact that you can just get unlucky, every hand takes, a couple of minutes. And so you can play thousands of them. And over the course of many hands, the overall shape of the game emerges. And that's what's really beautiful. And a game like Galcon is the same thing. It would not work if you had to invest half an hour or 45 minutes in a game. And then the results were just determined by, someone decided to attack someone else. And that was what determined the outcome. But because the games are extremely short, and it's and they're iterated. It's like the prisoner's dilemma, right? The prisoner's dilemma as a one-off, very, very different from the iterated prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, exactly. We know what the answer is for one-off. It turns out there is no stable strategy for iterating.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the prisoner's dilemma. It's when you have these long tournaments where the strategies involve not just what you're doing in the moment, but how you respond to other strategies over the course of an iterated session. So now in the case of, I don't know what would happen in Network Wars. I think part of its beauty is the dumb AIs as they exist, because it leads to like this deeper understanding of like, the kind of epiphany that I had about AI in general and about games and kind of being embedded in them, kind of knowing where you are in the metagame stack. You know what I mean? That's the secret. It's not just outplaying your opponent. It's like, where am I relative to my opponent in terms of my actions being determined by the rules of the game, and even a kind of optimal response to the rules of the game versus having a perspective that is outside the game and able to see it. That's why Magnus Carlsen is still the best chess player on the planet, even though he's chosen not to play chess in a way. Like the fact that Magnus Carlsen got bored of chess is a demonstration of his genius, right? Like the ability to get bored at a game is the precious thing that we have, that is ultimately the most valuable thing that we bring to a game. Yeah. It's not just the ability to optimize within the game, but the ability to like pull back and see ourselves in the game optimizing and just choose not to. I'd rather play this other game,
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that is true. And does seem to be at that point. Now, let me get to another point, which many of us have thought about. And truthfully, I could do the analysis and see, but I haven't yet. I'd love to get your subjective sense.
Okay.
All of us players who've played a bunch, get to these places where we're winning more than 80% of the games, right? And we sometimes can keep there for a few hundred games, but inevitably we crash, right?
Yeah.
And I'll often crash down to the high 60s. This is, again, for the last 100 games, which is my figure of merit. And so the question is it a run of bad luck, i.e. a long sequence of hard scenarios, or does our attention break in some sense, or do we get sucked into anti-patterns on some of the heuristics? What's your thought on that? I'm sure. First, I'll ask: have you had that sense that I can maintain the plus 80 for a while, but inevitably I break?
Yeah. No. When things are going well, you feel like, oh my God, I've cracked this game wide open. There's no way I'll ever lose again. And then you can go on a huge downswing and just like, what happened? And you're just, it's so sobering to be all of a sudden you're just losing over and over again. And you're just, you feel like almost like you've been kicked out of an airplane or something. And okay, so my answer to your question is, it's bad luck. Like, I'm not saying that I'm also not susceptible to bad play or tilt or, psychological, going on a streak where I'm not focused or not paying attention. But I think that this is just the reality of the game. Like poker, the long run is bigger than you think. The terrain of the curve that you're on, even if that curve is going up, it has bigger spikes and valleys than you expect. You expect it to be smooth, and it really isn't. And you're going to go on a stretch of a bunch of games that you lose that you played fine. So I don't think that those are the result of having a cold hand. I think they're just a result of randomness.
My guess is it's both, but I don't know what the weights are between the two. Because I will notice sometimes that if I start playing too automatically and too quickly, that seems to be correlated with these declines, right? Where I get into this sort of Zen state where it's just flow. Well, it turns out flow isn't quite as good as flow-ishness plus some analysis, something like that.
I agree, but here's the thing, Jim. As soon as I lose one or two games, I'm pretty focused because I care a lot about my long-term stats. I'm gonna go on the Jim Rudd show. He's gonna look at my stats. He's gonna talk about them to everybody. I'm really incentivized to make them as good as they can be. And so I start to pay attention, and I don't think I'm playing worse or making suboptimal decisions during those times. I really think that I'm on a downswing. And look, you played poker, you know what that's like. Poker is another game where, you can play for a year and think, oh, I'm never gonna lose at this game, right? I have a huge edge. I'm playing in these soft games, whatever. And then you can just go on a huge run, a terrible, terrible downswing. And the reality is that can happen to you even if you're playing optimally. And it's one of the beauties of poker is that you can never really know. Like, you look at your play and you're like, well, wait a minute. Like,
I played right, but I lost anyway. It happens all the time. And of course, that's why people love Texas Hold'em, because you can see all the mechanics, but only after the fact, right? Yeah, I actually sat at talk about the overlays, the soft tables. For 10 years, I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, when I was at the Santa Fe Institute. And the Indian casinos in northern New Mexico are like shooting fish in a barrel. These are the most ridiculously loose tables ever. And on my book, I'd only play 3 or 4 times a year because it embarrassed me to take money from these, Hispanic business guys. They were mostly like successful contractors, so they made enough money. But if I went to the casino 4 times in a year and I saw those guys there 3 times, a little bit of induction says, oops, they're probably there every day. And consider this. It seems impossible, but I typically played a 1-2 no limit Texas Hold'em table, and my win rate was $185 an hour, which seems impossible. That's how soft the table was.
Yeah, but that's an example of you having a big edge and also getting lucky. Like there's no way that your actual edge was that high.
Probably not, but it was big enough. But on the other hand, because they were so wild, I literally did see, fortunately I wasn't in the hand, and because I knew this one guy's behavior, that he always stayed with 7-2 unsuited, which for those of you who don't play Texas Hold'em is the worst starting position. He just had this stupid superstition that he did. And the son of a bitch pulled a boat and beat a guy with a big flush. It was a gigantic stake. But I knew I didn't have a hand to play anyway. But if I did, if I say I had trips, I would, and I started to see these cards fall, I go, that son of a bitch probably going to get the boat and, get the hell out of there. But, even with me with a big, big, big edge, I could certainly go for an 8-hour session and lose money without a doubt. Right. Yeah. Because again, these guys played a very high variance game, but fortunately it was tilted in the very, very, very loose. I mean, I think it was an average of 5.5 guys after the flop,
There's a certain style of play in some live games where the people are just there to get to play their cards. Right. For them, the game of poker is we all get dealt cards, and then some of us have, like, you get lucky and you get a good hand and it connects with the flop, and then you win that pot. And now it's my turn because I got lucky. Now it's your turn because you got lucky. And then occasionally you bluff. They'll throw a bluff in there some of the times, but mostly they're there to kind of just enjoy the churn of numbers and to like feel the fluctuations of fate kind of like pass through the game. And it's almost like it's a moral, it's like a norm for them. It's okay, now it's your turn, now it's my turn. And if you play the game in a more analytical way where you're trying to like find optimal moves and kind of like maximize your chance of winning, it's almost like you're kind of disturbing this collective agreement. And that is, it's a little bit like playing Network Wars. Like it's a guy recognizing that the opponents in Network Wars are following a set of rules that you don't have to follow, right? And that because they're constrained to those rules and their behavior is completely determined by them, you have this huge advantage because yours isn't, right? You don't have to sit around waiting until you get lucky. Right, you can make your own luck.
And as a kind of a really hardcore materialist, I don't believe in luck, right? But those guys clearly do, right? They clearly sense that they can feel the force, and they can't. I would say.
It's so funny because you don't believe in luck, Jim, but you made a little toy universe that has luck in it because you predetermined this seed, which all of the random rolls in Network Wars are actually predetermined by this deity which exists outside of the game, which is you.
We live in a Presbyterian universe, as it turns out, right?
And you have access to this information, right? The poor bots are just like struggling to keep afloat, whereas you could just look at the code and say, "Here's what's going to happen." You've given yourself these superpowers.
All right, let's move back to the topic you brought up, which is the idea of live Network Wars, 5 human players.
Yeah, okay.
One of my biggest fans, and he was all the way from my Windows days as a volunteer tester. He's played an embarrassing number of times. He keeps lobbying for me to do the 5 live players, but I don't know if the game would even make any sense with 5 players. But because you did hit on a key distinction is there communications or not between the players? If there's communications between the players, it's a totally different game than if there's not. One of the games I used to play when I was a teenager, we was Diplomacy. Did you ever play Diplomacy?
Right. Absolutely.
We were stabbing them in the back. But when we were about 19, we got together a couple of times in the summer. We were all home from college and played, I thought, the ultimate version of Diplomacy, which was we had a $20 buy-in, which back in the days when the minimum wage was $1.60, and both of us were working for $1.60, was significant money. And we made the rule that cash bribes were legal, but they had to be recorded with the referee. And the winner of the game was not the person that took over the map. And we had a rule for allocating the $20 buy-in pot based on the rules of diplomacy. You know, if you have a 4-person coalition, you divide the pot evenly, all that stuff. So, but the meta winner was the person that got the most money, whether they won or lost the game of diplomacy, because they were able to suck people into paying them bribes to either augment their part of a winning coalition or to win more money than anybody in a winning coalition might have via soliciting bribes. And I put that idea back to my friend, who said, that would be quite brilliant if you could figure out how to gamify that, where you'd have open communications pipelines, allow cash bribes, require a cash buy-in. And then the real winner is the person that collected the bribes, plus whatever they won as being part of a winning coalition, if they were part of one.
Yeah.
That'd be one way. The other way would be, and this is the war that the poker rooms have. I have never played online poker for money, not even once, because I'm so aware of what leverage even a small amount of collusion provides. And of course, they spend vast sums trying to detect any signs of collusion, but I would say they can't possibly totally stop it. And so if I were going to do a zero interaction version of Network Wars, I would want to do it with some pretty rigid anonymity features and make it very difficult, and have to have a large enough number of games going on that it becomes impractical for people to collude. And of course, unlike a poker table where each game would be fresh, you could mix and match the users together when they're ready to play. Any thoughts on those distinctions between the attempt to make it a isolated, no communications, a communications like diplomacy, or even crazier, a meta game where cash bribes are actually part of the game and part of the strategy?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think the first thing that you have to acknowledge is that it would be a totally new game, right? Because like I said, it looks like Network Wars is a strategy game that you are playing against a bunch of opponents, and the other opponents just happen to be AI. But then you quickly realize, no, it's not really a strategy game. It's mostly like a puzzle. It's like a Rubik's Cube, and it looks like a strategy game with opponents, but really it's kind of a Rubik's Cube because these opponents are just rules inside the game. And this is the sense in which the John von Neumann would say it's not a game at all. He doesn't think of chess as a game. Like for von Neumann, games are things like poker that involve modeling your opponents and making decisions based on what you think your opponents are going to do. And chess is just a puzzle, right? It's just a big math problem. Whereas poker, now that's a game. So it would really, you're talking about making a new game which kind of like uses the same underlying mechanics, but would quickly, I think, be overwhelmed by these kinds of issues of coordination, collusion, what we call politics in game design in general. Anytime there are opportunities for people to work together and steer kind of the outcomes by colluding in some way, either explicitly or implicitly, that's politics, right? So quickly, it would just become a game about politics. And in terms of whether or not you allow communication, I think that's huge, obviously, but it's not, I don't think it would be that different, because ultimately, even if you don't allow communication, your actions in the game are a form of communication, right? So for example, if I want to punish someone because I think that they've made a move that is unfair, or it's a move I don't like, there are ways I can attack them that are demonstrating punishment. I'm like, okay, I could take you over here, but I'm not. I'm going to attack this one node and I'm going to leave it there as a warning shot. You know what I mean? So people would find ways to communicate within the actions that you can take within the game. And there would be these elaborate kind of norms, I think, that evolved for communicating and kind of keeping people in check. And I think a lot would depend on whether I'm playing multiple sessions with the same people over and over again. If we sit down, then it gets interesting. I would definitely be interested in that. I would like it to be, again, short sessions so that, there is some timer. I think you'd need to introduce a timer to keep these things moving. And then I think it would be interesting to see how that evolved. And I love the idea of doing it with money. So I actually think that there's something that happens when you introduce betting that often elevates a game, because it encourages people to think not only what is the optimal move in this situation, but to think abstractly how strong is that move? Like to understand the whole range of possibilities. Like if you think about the doubling cube in backgammon, right? Backgammon, one of the oldest games on the planet that is still currently played for fun, right? Thousands of years old. People have been playing backgammon forever. The doubling cube, which many people think as the thing that really makes backgammon a masterpiece, is this ability to like decide at a certain point, okay, I'm so strong in this position that I can offer you double stakes, and you can either have to accept that or not. And all of a sudden now we're like thinking about in the meta terms about how the game is going to play out. The doubling cube was just invented like 100 years ago, like early 20th century and the Lower East Side. You know what I mean? Like,
oh, I love that. I did not know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, like that, what it did for the game. And another example of this is contract bridge, right? The difference between playing bridge, playing whist, playing bridge, just trying to like find the best moves versus when you have bidding that allows you to kind of like to make predictions about what's going to happen in the overall game. And the real skill is in this ability to kind of like model what's going to happen.
And send false signals. Obviously, that's a huge part of contract.
Exactly. Now you're opening up this whole channel for communication. You're giving moves extra meaning because they now are referring back to this larger system of what your prediction about the overall game is going to be. And so I think that there's something really interesting about human network wars with cash. That's the version of it that I would be most interested in playing.
Unfortunately, damn hard to do in the United States due to the sons of guns and their regulations against gambling. You have to put it on the Isle of Man or something like that.
Or mint a coin.
Yeah.
Is that how how crypto works? I don't know.
Yeah, we could possibly do that. It's possible. So I'm going to go back and think again about multiplayer network wars. Maybe it's not as hopeless as I think, and I'll have to explore the design space in a larger way, including how I think about signaling and implicit politics or explicit politics, etc. I have a list of like 20 enhancements for Network Wars 2.0, but none of them have anything to do with the core game itself. They're all about leaderboards and ELO ratings and things of that sort. Actually, I have one called the Advanced Duplicate Tournament. They take off the idea of duplicate bridge. Ranks, people work their way up by, if you win 20 games in a row, you become a lieutenant colonel or something, right? But nothing in the game itself. Zero. I'm actually quite happy with the game as it is in terms of a single player game. Is there any ideas that you had as the king of games when you were playing this thing that you would do differently that might make it a better game?
No, I think you're thinking along exactly the right lines. This first of all, I think the domain of metagame design is itself really fun and fascinating, and a place where a lot of people don't innovate. Right? They're not thinking about how to take an existing game or existing set of mechanics and find the right context for it, frame it in the right way, think about the kind of long-term experience. Unfortunately, we have the kind of business of games, especially the business of mobile games, is a real cesspool. And it drags, there's a strong incentive that's kind of drags games down into this kind of Vegas style approach where you're just trying to maximize time on device. Because with the way the revenue generation works,
ad-based revenue, which I hate.
Yeah, and if you're just trying to entrap people and maximize time on device and get them to play as much as possible, that is something that is counter to discovering the kind of really genuinely rich and interesting and cool kinds of contexts that you could make. I've often thought that Las Vegas. I mean, I love Las Vegas. I like gambling. I think it's fun, but I also recognize the way it kind of degrades certain kinds of experiences. It kind of like drags them down to this kind of simplistic and rote kind of dynamics. And I think that it's an unexplored terrain, an unexplored design terrain, like smart, interesting gambling games. Right? Like games that combine randomness and fluctuation and variance and gambling and betting and wagering with strategy and calculation and interesting social interaction. I mean, imagine if the lottery was like an interesting puzzle that people could do. And in a sense it is, right? Because people, people can sometimes discover that there's an edge in the lottery that people have overlooked, and that they find certain techniques or certain ways. But imagine designing games like that that would encourage people and incentivize people to be creative and to like think about the thing not just as, am I going to get touched by the hand of God and be the lucky one, be the chosen one, but also, can I apply myself to figure out what's going on here and improve my chances?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, large scale emergent gambling that has the idea of gradually uncovering heuristics.
Yeah. Like, imagine if you and your friends could go to Vegas and there was a table game that you could play where you were actually like collaborating and working together and making decisions the same way you would if you were, on a League of Legends team, where it's like, okay, your role is to do this and my role is to do this. I mean, that's what it's like when you're part of a card counting group. But I'm talking about something that's explicitly designed to allow for that and encourage that. I mean, it's a hard design problem, but it's not impossible.
That's interesting. Now, God damn it! Now you put another worm in my head, right? I will definitely be thinking about this. All right. Well, we've talked a bunch about network wars. It's been a wonderful conversation. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody about network wars quite this long. I do have one guy who I talk to about like this.
Yeah.
In the last 10 minutes, why don't you back up a little bit and tell us a little bit about your thinking about games in general, and particularly maybe some of the ideas that you're going to be putting in your new book, The Beauty of Games, or otherwise.
Yeah.
What is the Frank Lantz big picture about games? You've certainly alluded to bits and pieces of it, but let's see if you can give us, a few minutes, 10 minutes maybe worth of, straight from the dude himself.
Okay. Well, before we move off of network wars, there's one more thing I want to say about it.
Okay.
Which is that a year ago, I had a really bad year. My wife had some health issues and she's fine now. So everything's good. But it was like a really, really, really bad year. The kind of stuff that you're in the hospital, you're going through surgeries, you're going through treatments. And it was really rough. And I played a lot of network wars during that time. And it kind of kept me sane. And I think there is a quality of games that they can do that for people. And I think it's a real value of games. And I think it's sometimes looked down on. We think of it as like, escapism, this ability of games to sort of absorb our attention and to kind of expand in our heads to such a degree that they kind of crowd out our own, thoughts and feelings. And I think there can be great beauty in that. And I think that the fact that a game can be a source of comfort, in addition to being a source of ideas and intellectual exploration, that sometimes, games can be a thing where you're standing in a dark place and you need to have a little warmth and a little light, and games can be that source. I made a game called Drop 7 that I think a lot of people have this kind of relationship to. It's a very abstract game. It's similar to Network Wars in some ways, in the sense that it's a minimalist game. It's very abstract, a little puzzle game. And a friend of mine once said that he was on an airplane and this airplane hit some very bad turbulence, the kind that you're not sure if you're going to make it, right? And this was really, really bad. He looked over and the woman sitting next to him was clearly very upset, very scared. And she was playing Drop 7. And that made me really happy when he told me the story. It made me very proud that at this moment, at this dark moment, standing on the precipice, looking into the void, that this woman turned to this game that I had made and found some comfort there. That made me really proud. And your game did that for me.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear that. That really warms my heart because, I knew it would be a game people would enjoy, and it's a pastime that is nonetheless kind of good for heightening your cognition. So I don't feel terrible about sucking people into it. But I'm also glad I deliver this kind of experience that I really didn't even think about. So thank you for telling me about that. It really made my day.
Thank you. I needed it, and it was there for me. So I appreciate that. I think, and yeah, I mean, my overall, I wrote this book. I've been teaching game design for a long time. I love games. I love thinking about games. I love playing games. And I also think that games are kind of deeply confusing. I think a lot of people who aren't inside of the world of games, who don't play a lot of games. I think they look at games and they realize there's something going on there. It's kind of interesting. It has something to do with computers. There's a lot of people doing it, but it also seems very confusing. Like, what is it? Like, what are these things? Are they just like, are they hedonistic appliances that you kind of plug into the wall and then they take you to a dream world and you get to imagine that you're a fireman or a dragon or whatever? And I want with my book, I want to share my way of looking at games and thinking about what makes them interesting and beautiful and meaningful and important. And I think it really starts from the idea that they are something like music or literature or film, that they're a creative form. There's something we do for their own sake, that we do because we find them interesting and meaningful and beautiful and expressive, but in a very particular way. Like the unlike any other art form, games have so much engineering in them, right? There's so much about problem solving that they really are the art form of problem solving, right? They are the art form of interactivity. They have this deep relationship to computers. Like, games predate computers. Obviously, games have been around since before the dawn of civilization. But I think in some ways, in some ways games invented computers. You know what I mean? Games were doing computation before computers existed, right? Games were one of the inspirations for computers.
Yeah, we know for sure that gambling motivated Pascal to
Absolutely.
understand probability, for
Yeah.
sure, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think looking at the Mechanical Turk was supposedly one of the things that inspired Babbage to work on the analytical engine, and Turing, like, one of the first things he did was write a chess program, right? Before he had invented the idea of computers, he was like, well, here's how you would like write a chess playing program, right? So this idea of kind of algorithmic thinking, of kind of the rules-based behavior kind of exists in games. And when computers finally came around, I think the intersection of games and computers obviously like brought about this huge explosion of creativity and kind of led to the world we live in now, where digital games, video games, and computer games are, arguably one of the most complex, interesting, important forms of culture that's on the planet. But I still think kind of poorly understood, right? Like, there's a sense in which they are so complex and hard to kind of like wrap your head around, that kind of building this shared literacy that is an important part of having them continue to kind of evolve and grow and fulfill their capacity, I think is the project that I want to be a part of, right? Is one of the reasons that I was drawn into teaching games and game design and helping develop the program at NYU. And I just, so that's, that's essentially the kind of what the overall project of the book is. It's about trying to understand like how to think about games within this larger context of them as a form of culture, right? That have the same kind of expressive power that these other creative forms have, but their own unique version of it that has to do with problem solving and logic and rules and all of these things that we think of as in some ways of being the opposite of creativity, right? We think of creativity as being about spontaneous kind of emotional responses, intuitive responses, and then we think of games about being these kind of deterministic things where the rules kind of like create this limited set of possible behaviors and you're trying to extrapolate from that. But the reality is that is, I think, the thing that gives games as a form of culture their angle on the contemporary world that is unlike any other form of culture. I think that they have a power to like help us understand the world we live in, ourselves, each other, in a way that that is just like profound and meaningful and beautiful. And it is this contrast, I think, that between between kind of logic and reason, kind of instrumental reason, the things that we apply ourselves to when we're trying to solve a problem, and the things that we find kind of irreducibly complex and beautiful about art, right? The things that art is, by its nature, it's kind of always eludes our attempts to explain it and to form an objective kind of explanation about how it works and what it's for. It's because it exists a little bit outside of the ordinary course of events where we're explaining things and putting values on things and determining. And so it is in this combination, I think, that games have they kind of open up a window on the world that is, truly special and different. And that's kind of what the book is exploring.
Sounds fascinating as can be. Let's definitely have you back on the show when it comes out, and we'll go into the book in great detail. Because as I mentioned, I've been playing games and designing playing games strategy games since I was 10, and designing them from the time I was 12. Not that I've ever made a living at it, but I'm sure we can have a great conversation. I really look forward to it. And as we sign off here, people who want to play Network Wars, networkwars.com will provide you links to the Apple App Store and to Google Play. And you can search there for Network Wars, 2 words. Download the app, 99 cents. And you can have as much fun as Frank and I have had playing this game and having this wonderful conversation today, Frank. It's really been great.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I've enjoyed it.
Audio production and editing by Andrew Blevins Productions. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.